Okay, welcome everybody. This is what we call at IAS Commons. We try to start a new series of talks. One reason is because there's many faculties or researchers at Hong Kong UST who are doing very exciting work that the rest of the community should know about. And I really didn't have a chance until I went to Central, where there's organized lunch for science, give talks by UST faculty, that I realized, wow, they're doing very interesting work. But you don't hear on campus. So we decided to have this IAS Commons where UST faculty will give informal lectures on topics that can be of general interest to the whole community. And it's sort of informal. We have one last time by Ping, but we're going to have 4 this semester, and we're going to have 4 next semester. That's roughly our plan, once a month during the term. And this semester we have arranged already all the speakers, but next semester we're looking for speakers. So either you volunteer, you may not be chosen, but if you think what you're doing very interesting, you can volunteer, or you think of somebody, your professor or somebody in your lab is doing, or somebody in your field is doing some exciting work that can be of interest to the general community, let us know. Okay, so we're trying to pick people for next semester, the spring. So today, we are very lucky to have Professor Christopher Pissarides to give a talk. He needs no introduction, and his talk will be the new normal in China, lessons from Europe. So, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, I've just been to China. I've given a talk to a couple of universities and to other big forums, and the big topic of discussion is the new normal, which I didn't hear myself firsthand, but apparently the Prime Minister made a speech at the Summer Davos, I think it was, in China somewhere last month, where he said China is entering a new normal, by which he meant slower growth rates and possibly some deindustrialization, and that people, businesses, and all that, they should prepare for that new normal situation rather than the one that it's been experiencing for the last 20 to 30 years, which is growth of a period of fast growth. So all the interest was in that. So I sat and thought, Europe went through that situation in the early 70s mostly, with the exception of countries like Britain, to which it happened late 19th, early 20th century, and of course the United States went through that much earlier. But in some ways, many people believe that Europe messed up some things, not everything, although sometimes you get the impression that they messed up everything, but I think they got some things right. And so I thought I would talk, and I did at those universities, tell them, so what lessons are there to be learned, and what policy reforms do you need to make sure that you get it right, given that other countries have experienced it, and sort of learning from their mistakes in a way. So what I will do is that I have a presentation here, which could probably take 30 to 35 minutes, and then open it up to questions so that we can discuss things that interest you if I miss them out in this presentation. Okay, well, what's the recent history? Well, the recent history that we've experiencing is very fast growth rates. I said here more than 7 to 8%, but the average 10% over long periods of time. Of course, that's unprecedented over the length of time. I mean, there are countries that have had that kind of rate. Even Japan, the rate's close to 10%, and of course South Korea as well. But over shorter periods of time, at such great length, I think it's unprecedented. And very briefly, and at the risk of oversimplification, the reasons that I put down to it, or rather what those growth rates were due to, there were the market reforms that enable workers to move from agriculture to industry, where productivity was higher, and then the reliance of cheap labor in industry to make Chinese manufactured goods more competitive in world markets. So in a way, it was like agricultural workers who were who were on very low pay, continued on low pay, but producing manufacturing goods which were then sold abroad. So it was like a sort of export-driven growth based on cheap labor. Now, could this continue? Well, when you look at the figures, I think the answer is yes, it could continue for quite a while, because there is still a large labor force in agriculture. It's something like 35 to 40%. Real wages are rising, but they're still very low by Western standards. And the main thing is that when you're exporting, it's not only the cost that matters, it's also quality. But despite sort of despite reputations abroad which are not justified, I think Chinese manufactured goods are considered to be good enough, like in construction, in the sort of high street kind of shops. Of course, I mean, they don't have the sort of panache or luxury of German goods, say, like cars, household appliances and all that, but at the mid-level below, they're still the dominant product worldwide. So there's no reason why it shouldn't continue like that for a while. But of course, eventually, in the longer term, that will come to an end, partly because agricultural labor will dry up. It will go down to 10%. You can't sort of push it below that very fast. And more importantly, and in a way, it's a welcome development that wages will keep rising to make goods less competitive. I say it's welcome because with so much growth, if it's going to be sustainable, and if it's going to be a country without sort of future problems, it has to be an inclusive growth. I mean, then large sections of the population, if not the entire population, has to benefit from growth. And of course, the way you benefit from growth is not through government transfers, but through higher wages that match the higher productivity and of course higher profits, but not everything going to the top incomes the way it's been doing in the United States, for example. You wouldn't want that kind of capitalism. So eventually, Chinese industry will lose its competitiveness, and I think if you look at the geography of industrial development, it will first lose its competitiveness to the other Asian neighbors, and eventually everyone will lose their competitiveness to Africa. When I gave this recently, someone got up and said to me, and what will happen when Africa is finished with competitiveness as well? Who's going to become competitive after that? They said, when we run out of countries. I don't think we need to worry about that as yet, but there is an answer. So the new normal is what China will gradually enter it when there will be a lower growth rate. I mean, it will not be ridiculously low growth rate, but it might be 5% instead of where it is now. But more importantly, and what I'm going to say is that the service sector will dominate employment and production, the way it's dominating in Europe, for example. And the share of agriculture will shrink. Now, agriculture in most European countries employs about 3 to 4% of the population. The United States, I think, they can feed the entire country with about 2% of the population working in agriculture. It's extremely efficient. It's also a feature of British agriculture, actually. What astonishes me in Britain when I compare with Cyprus, where I come from, but also here in China, when I went out into the countryside, is for how many hours you could walk through agricultural land in Britain without seeing a single person. You just see machinery and animals. There are no people basically on the land. There is only, and also British agriculture has the other feature where the agricultural workers behave like aristocrats. They send their children to very expensive private schools. They live in very big houses and talk BBC English, which shows how productivity can influence the way we look at agriculture and the way that it produces. And eventually that will come, but it's taken Britain and the United States about 100 years to reach that stage. So there's still time. More relevant to China is what will happen to industry. And if you look at all the industrialized countries, all these sort of, what you might call post-industrialized countries, they never employ more than about 20 to 25% of the labor force in industry. Even in Germany, it's about that. And it's coming down, actually, in Germany very fast. And again, that's due to productivity, because industry is becoming so productive, you can produce all the Mercedes and BMWs that the world wants with robots and fewer and fewer people being employed there. So job creation will be in the service sector, as I will talk a little bit later on. You can see here the typical scenario of a transformation. And this is the United States, which is most advanced in this transformation, where you can see that, what was happening. What was happening here is that I'm going to show you a picture that shows that China is somewhere here. But what you see is that agriculture beginning the late 19th century, just after the Civil War, when the industrial development of the United States really started. You can see agriculture going from 50% to 2% down here. And approximately, this time, 1970 actually, 70 to 72 is a kind of turning point for the United States economies when industrial decline came and the service economy developed. And you can see that agriculture by that time reached about less than 5% of the population. Industrial employment was rising and reached 40% at the end of the First World War. Ignore this, which is the Great Depression, but it remained at about 40% until 1970, and then came down to 25% in the years after that. It's what American economists call the Great Productivity Slowdown. And whereas service economy has been absorbing everyone leaving from agriculture and industry, in fact, overall employment has increased here a lot because of the participation of women. So what the service economy has been doing was to absorb the men who'd been released by industry and agriculture and absorb the women who'd been leaving the home to come in to work. So now we have something like 75% of the labor force being in the service sector, and that's where we are all tending, I think, but not many countries are there. This is China, comparable figures, and of course agriculture is much bigger, like 60% in the late 80s. It's now down to about 35. And that's the basis on which I'm saying that there is still scope to continue this productivity. The Green Revolution is not quite there. It hasn't quite decimated the countryside the way it did in Britain and the United States. But then service employment is already taking over industrial employment, which is only 30%, whereas service employment is 35%. And they're rising together. What you would expect to see in the new normal is this red line, which is industrial employment slowing down, flattening off and coming down, whereas this blue line accelerating over time. And one more comparison that I have is with a country that had a late development in Europe, which is Spain. It could have been Italy or anything, actually. There's no difference between them in this respect. Which again, in fact, Spain mirrors China more. Spain in the 1970s mirrors China here, because you can see the industrial employment rising like that, and the service employment above industrial and both rising, which is what you have here. And what I said about industry in China, where you expect it to flatten off and come down, you see in Spain here in the 1980s. It flattened off at 35% and then started coming down, and it's now 20%. Although this year is a great recession, but I don't think it's going to go up above 20%, whereas service employment is up to 75%. What's been happening in Spain actually since 1970 mirrors very much what's happening in China since 2000. And you would expect it to follow that path over time. It's sort of, Spain had, 40 years since then. So if you extrapolate from that, you would expect China to deindustrialize effectively the way Spain has in the next 30 to 40 years. But up to that point, there might well be continuation of what we've been seeing. All right, now the main things that I want to bring out more as a points of discussion than anything else is how do we manage, how can China manage that transition, and what can it learn from Europe? And I've singled out three things in managing that transition. The first one is that it has to find a new niche in the international economy, other than low-cost manufacturing, where it's dominated now. And second, it has to manage the fast growth of service jobs and the decline of industrial jobs. It's a structural change that needs to be managed. And finally, for sustainability and everyone's happiness, it needs to create a social support system, a social welfare system. Because every country needs one, even the United States, although Senate doesn't always seem to think that, but they do need it. For urban labor, because once you live in cities, you can't rely on family support and friends supporting you. The government needs to support poverty and various other things that I'll point out. All right, let's begin with the first one, with production and trade. What defines your success in trade? If you are economic students, you will know, of course, is the law of comparative advantage, which says that you should identify the things that you can do relatively better than other countries. Not necessarily absolutely, like you're not going to find things that you can do better than the Americans do, for example, or the Germans, and say that's what you're going to do. You may not find anything at all, but you have to find goods that you can do relatively better than them when you compare with the other things that you can do. And of course, you should be looking both at goods, manufacturing, production, in other words, and services, because something like 40% of international trade is in services. I think the number is right about that. I mean, quite a lot of services are being traded. The most famous ones being financial services. I guess being in Hong Kong, you'll know that financial services are one of the main export commodities of Hong Kong. Tourism, being Greek, I should know that. One of the main export of Greece is tourism. And transport, in fact, is the other main export of Greece, shipping. And manufacturing, which is the main export of countries like Germany in Europe. All right, now, I think the prospects for China, I don't think there's much doubt, actually, where China is leading to in that respect. You can learn from the history of Japan to make sure that that's where you see it going. But it's in higher technology manufacturing rather than services that I mentioned, rather than financial services or accounting or business services or tourism or transport. And the reason is that these three things that I put together, which are the three things that when they come together, you know that you have a very good prospect of success. One of them is that the labor force is acquiring a lot of education. The main, mainland Chinese students are the main foreign group in Western universities. Their own universities are expanding very rapidly. Standards are very high, especially on the technological training. Then many, if not most of the world's high-tech companies, including the top American companies like Apple and Silicon Valley, once they mature, have some operations in China and employ Chinese workers, and there's a lot of learning by doing in there, so there is a kind of concentration of knowledge on the job. And finally, the government is shifting emphasis, from what I'm told, from providing industrial parks for mass production to encouraging more the high-tech industrial parks. I've seen a couple, in fact, on my trips there, and they do look impressive. So what you have is new research taking place here by qualified people, and also people learning on the job. And when you put the three together, you would expect that the next move is at that level. Now, given where the country is now, it's reached a point where R&D needs to invent new things, so either new production techniques or new products, rather than imitate Western industry, but producing things cheaper, which what's been doing so far. And the government does need to encourage more R&D. I mean, it's doing it and it's rising. It's not quite at the top levels. You know, there's much more R&D being done in the more mature industrial societies of the West, but it's moving in that direction. And when you see that and say you compare with Japan 30 years earlier, there is no reason why you wouldn't expect big Chinese companies to grow and dominate certain sectors of the of world trade in the way that the big Japanese ones like Sony, Mitsubishi, and so on have dominated trade over the last 20 or 30 years, or one or two South Korean companies. So I mean, like, I don't think there is any doubt that that's the direction that they want to move, and what I'm saying is that all the elements seem to be there to make a success of that. Where there might be some more doubts as to how far you can go is that is the emphasis on management, because good governance, once a company becomes big and complicated, is extremely important. It's as important as new technology. You know, because, yeah, you know, I mean, you might ask, why do countries fail? I think countries basically fail not because they don't know the technology. You can learn the technology easily enough by studying what other countries are doing. I mean, they fail because of poor governance, and it's down to management and political interference and so on. So that's more important ultimately than the other, and especially on things like intellectual property rights that need to be secured. Otherwise, that will stifle R&D. I haven't really studied this very much of what's going on in China. It's more of what other people who studied it told me, and it's not even consistent. But apparently, China does have its own intellectual property rights legislation, but it doesn't recognize other countries' legislation, and that's always a problem. Like you can go and copy something discovered in another country and go and register it in China as your own, and apparently it will hold. That's what, as I say, it's what lawyers call hearsay. It's what other people told me, but if that's true, which I suspect actually, the people who told me true because they were one of the sufferers. It was a small Greek company that made some major discovery that gave it a lot of market share and success in Europe, and they cannot do it in China because someone else had registered something very similar in China, and the Chinese market is being closed off. I mean, these things need to be corrected. That's what as I say, you know, don't ask me more details because I don't know them, but intellectual property rights do need to be global rather than each country having its own system. Now, what about education? Well, education, as I said, it is doing very well, both at home and abroad, and there is some cooperation between educational institutions and industry, but not to the extent that we see in the very successful cases. The most successful of all, of course, being Stanford, Berkeley, and Silicon Valley in California, then MIT in Massachusetts, and the digital industry around Route 128, Cambridge in the UK, and the industrial parks. We do, those are very important. We do need to have those if we're going to combine pure research with applied research in industry, in practice. And one of maybe the second lecture you're going to have in this series is a very good example of cooperation between university and Silicon Valley. Isn't Ching giving the second lecture here? Ching Tang? Yeah. So you'll hear more about it then. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that. I don't think, I mean, there are efforts to make Shanghai a world financial center. I mean, that needs a lot of work, and I don't see it happening in the foreseeable future, given government's role in the financial sector. All right, what about the second point I want to emphasize, which is transition to a service economy? Well, most new creation from now on will be in services, there's no doubt, both high-skill ones and low-skill. Now, in terms of numbers, you could distinguish them. I mean, high-skill services like business services, accountants, financiers, they will be small in number, but they're more important in terms of productivity improvements and where the country is going. But the very big numbers of job creation, the kind of sectors that will attract the jobs that will be lost in industry, because I said to you, the industry maybe will go up to 35%, and then it's going to come down to 20%. Well, where is that 15% going to go? Well, they're going to go into low-skilled, semi-skilled, low-skilled services, like in the retail sector is probably would be the main one that will attract that, in personal service, domestic service, catering services, healthcare services. That's the type of job that will attract the big numbers. So the skilled jobs like accountants and management consultants and those who work for people like McKinsey and PwC and KPMG, and also the business consultants themselves would be the ones that will drive business development and will be extremely important in the governance of big businesses, like I mentioned before. But the big numbers that will be absorbed from agriculture industry will be in the lower skilled ones there. And there is quite, it's not easy to manage that sector, the industrial sector. In fact, Europe is still failing in that. You can put down failures in many different instances, actually. One of them is that schools and universities are not geared to providing training that is suitable to that kind of job. I don't know. I can give you an example, which is the only one I know, in fact, of why it's different. You see, in industry, when you work in industry, when you leave school and you go and work in industry or somewhere else, then you work very much on your own to very detailed instructions together with a machine. So what you need to understand is the basic mechanism in the machine and how to work with the machine, how to manage the machine, if you like. If you go into the service sector, the main type of job you are going to have will be interaction with a person, not a machine. So your main skill there to make you successful is the ability to interact with another person who might have completely different needs from you and completely different way of thinking. And that's the kind of training that we don't give at schools at all. Like if you look at a high school, what training people have, do they have training to understand the personality of other people and how to interact for them in a job? And the answer is no. I'm not aware of any kind of instruction at school that teaches you about interpersonal relationships. But that's going to be the main job of the future. In retailing, you're going to look after a customer. In healthcare, you're going to be a nurse to a patient, to an ill person. In education, which is another, if you look at where are those services that I listed? I know it's moving in the wrong direction. Sorry, I've lost it now. Let me see. Yeah, these jobs here. If you look, retail is interpersonal, catering is interpersonal. Someone is cooking food and giving it to you, for example. Domestic service is interpersonal. You get into someone's house to do work. Personal trainer services are important. All these involve interaction between people. So when I say that you need to manage that at university level, you need to introduce new courses that rely on things like psychology and social interaction and so on, which are not given. Then training for things like accounting standards and law governing property rights and all that is also something else that you don't get much training of. You get technical training instead, which is good for industry but not so good for services. So that's point number one, where they say failure. And business managements point that out actually all the time about failures there. I heard some very, very top managers myself at the World Economic Forum meetings in Davos complaining that they get people from school, they get school leavers. I mean, not university graduates, because university graduates will not be doing these types of jobs, but high school leavers, they get them into their jobs and they don't know how to interact with other people. They're being silly, as they put it, instead of being professional in their interactions. The second one is that liberalization of the service sector is proving very difficult in Western economies, much more difficult than liberalization of manufacturing. And this aspect that again is down to the interpersonal aspect of it. We have a very good example of that. I'm sure it hasn't reached you over here, but I can tell you what it is. But I mean, like if you look at Europe now, and I mean, which country is the one that presents itself as the champion of a fully liberalized economy and productive and fantastic, and everyone else should do the same? It's Germany. You know, it's bullying the Southern European countries to liberalize themselves and make themselves like Germany. Well, very recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Germany, in fact, disallowed the use of internet taxi booking service called Uber, which is an American service developed in Silicon Valley, for no reason whatsoever. It was just the lobby of taxi drivers was so strong that persuaded them to disallow it. You can only call a German taxi by telephone, you can hail them down in the street, but you cannot make your booking on the internet following Uber because it affected the taxi drivers. Well, this is a typical case of failure to liberalize the service sector, in this case transportation. And there are many other examples. Now, even China is experiencing some difficulties with that, especially at the high-skilled services end, where the services still belong to the state sector. Finance is controlled by state companies, for example. Accounting services are practically non-existent other than that. So that I think is the most important thing that they need to pay attention to avoid the mistakes that even Germany is making. So how do you improve it? Well, you need to open up the service sector, including finance. You need to open up to market forces. You need to have more competition there, and you can see, again, I think recently, someone else was saying that very recently, actually. I don't think it was here, though, that for example, the cost of borrowing money in China is extremely high. And that's because the supplier is a monopoly, it's the state, so they can determine how much they're going to charge. And interest rates are much higher than what you can get in Western countries. That's a case of not liberalizing the sector, not opening it up to market competition. And as I mentioned, Europe is still struggling in that respect. Many services like air transport, for example, haven't been liberalized. You know, we're supposed to have a single market in Europe, but you cannot use a British airliner to fly between Germany and Italy. You have to use either a German airliner or an Italian airliner. You know, this is not liberalized, although despite the single market, accounting and financial standards are not common yet. And many other lower skill services are not liberalized at all. So it's important to set standards there right from the start and do it because that's where the jobs are going to go. And if you don't do it, you are not going to create enough jobs, and you are going to have high unemployment of the kind that we're experiencing in Spain and other countries. Now, as an illustration, I said I would take 35 minutes, but it looks like I'm close. As an illustration, I use health because I think health is going to be the biggest problem eventually for us, for sure, and possibly for China, I don't know. And the reason is that health is what economists call a luxury good. As an economy becomes richer, we increase our demand for health services at a faster rate than the increase in our income. And therefore, we have to provide more and more, we have to allow for more and more provision of health services. And the other reason, of course, that health will be important is that the population is aging with economic growth. We get better nutrition, better medicines, we live longer, and older people have more demand for health services than younger people. So you have two reasons why the demand for health services will go up. Now, governments usually support health provision. All governments do it, in fact, as part of their social policy. And the question is, how do you do those things? You know, on the one hand, a very fast increasing demand for health services. On the other hand, government trying to support at least the lower end for services. Well, I don't think there is a completely satisfactory answer yet, but we have two systems, both of which have failed in my view. The one is the British system, where there's 100% subsidization. It started in 1948. same year as China, as I'm learning. No, I knew it actually. The reason it's not working is that it's just becoming too expensive. You know, if health costs, if the demand for healthcare is rising faster than GDP, it means that you have to raise taxes to pay for it faster than GDP, which means that tax rates have to keep going up. We're now somewhere at 45%. You know, where is it going to go? But then no politician dares touch it because it's one of the sacred cows of Britain. If you touch it, you lose the election. So it's a good recommendation to make to Mr. Cameron, I guess. And the other extreme is the United States, where support is only at the lower end, the very poor end, and is mainly reliance on the private insurance market. But because of moral hazard and other problems, costs are rising very, very fast, much faster than GDP, not at the speed of rise of the demand for health services. In fact, since the 1980s, health costs in the United States have increased by a factor of 7 more than costs of other services, like other personal services. And obviously that system is unsustainable as well. Where are costs going to go? You know, the insurance companies will go bankrupt if they don't increase premiums to very high levels. So that's something, you know, obviously the optimal system is something in between, but whether we succeed in finding one, I don't know. Now, finally, we need to think about providing social support, because in an urbanized society, unemployment is an inevitable outcome of the transition, and in a service economy, in a dynamic economy, there's continuous job churning. Some jobs close down, others open up. In services, job churning is much more than it is in industry. And also information is changing very fast in the service economy. And inevitably, there will be unemployment in between as people move from one job to another. In fact, some unemployment is necessary to facilitate the process of job search and matching, but the question is how much and how do you manage it? Well, in very successful Western economies, unemployment is down to 5 to 6%. In others, it's up to 10%. It really depends on institutional arrangements. The important thing I want to emphasize here is that we know now, after many, many years of work on unemployment, that there is a role for government. You cannot leave unemployment entirely to the free market. You're going to get some very bad failures if you do that. And all governments take on the role of supporting unemployment. The question is, how do you support unemployment? In China, in fact, there is almost no support for unemployment from what I know. And this is one area where they do need to pay a lot more attention. And I described to you here a very bad practice for supporting unemployment, which luckily is not being introduced by many countries now, but those who have it are finding it extremely difficult to get rid of it. And this is to try and protect workers. When governments try and protect workers from unemployment by imposing restrictions on employers, in effect, what governments are trying to do here is to shift the responsibility for looking after the worker to the employer instead of taking it on themselves. But this usually has the opposite effect from the one they desire. And the reason is that employers are not social workers. Employers are good at creating jobs and producing and selling their goods, not at providing social services. And their response when they do that is that, do I really want to take on a worker who might have too many social demands on me? And the answer is no. So you only open jobs and recruit workers that you think will be likely to leave if things don't go well. You don't recruit too many, and as a result, and the outcome is to have a worse outcome for workers than the one that you would have got if you left employers entirely free to do what they know how to do best, which is create jobs and produce. And yet governments do exercise it. I mean, the most famous country three most famous countries that practiced this was France, Spain, and Italy. Spain has reformed it actually in law, so this doesn't hold anymore in the legislation. But in practice, they do it because unions insist that there is strong resistance to adapting to the new legislation. So there's been no sign on the statistics that are coming out of that country yet, although the reforms took place in 2010, 4 years ago, because of union pressure mainly. France hasn't managed to reform it yet, and it's one of the things that is plaguing the current government, because being a socialist government, at first they said they wouldn't reform the system, now they realize that they don't have a choice, so they keep changing government, changing ministers. And Italy, of course, hasn't reformed it. Italy is unreformable, in fact, I'm convinced about that nowadays. Now, Italy is the Japan of Europe before Abe. They need to have their Abe. Okay, how should you do it? Well, government should take on the role of protecting workers from poverty and unemployment, and let employers get on with their job. Private insurance, of course, is out of the question because of moral hazard. If no private insurer can ever make money from supporting unemployment. And family support, which is what the Chinese rely on mainly now, and the Greeks rely on that, in fact, and the Italians. It will not be there for very long. Once you urbanize, you lose touch with your family, little by little, but steadily. Now, what's this? You can see confidence right in here. The key to success, The answer is that we don't really know, but I think this is more successful than the previous ones that I mentioned to you, that a successful social support system for the unemployment is one that gives, at least in my view, it's one which compensates unemployed workers generously, say 60%, 70% of their income, but not for long, for a short period of time. Say, I usually say something like 6 months. In recession, it might go up to 9 months, but not longer than that. I mean, in that respect, the famous Obama extension of unemployment insurance from 6 months to 2 years, it wasn't really a good idea in recession, but it was temporary. That's the only good thing. That's the only good thing about it. And it had negative implications for unemployment in the United States. But it could be high but the important thing is for a short period of time. And if the worker is still unemployed at the end of it, then there should be compulsory participation in a suitable program run by the government. That's where the failure of the Obama administration actually in that respect was. They didn't have any programs for the unemployed if they were still unemployed after a long period of time. And as I was saying, it shows up in the unemployment statistics. For the first time, the United States experienced long duration unemployment. Now, apart from unemployment, in post-industrial society, you're going to have inequality, which they're experiencing already in China. That needs support, some kind of redistribution. There's going to be poverty for some people. Housing problems are going to arise. There is less family support within the household. There is disability. There is mental health. All those things need to come under a comprehensive social welfare support system. And the best one is the one that is known in Europe now as Flexicurity. It combines flexibility for the employer, and security for the employee. Security is funded by the government, and flexibility is ensured by the law. It's developed in Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries. It works effectively there. The only downside is the high fiscal cost. But because governments in Scandinavia and the Netherlands are trusted by the people, they don't mind paying their high taxes and seeing them provide efficient services. I doubt whether a system like that could work in countries like Italy and Greece, because people are so suspicious of government, they would try and find ways how not to pay the tax. But it's good to keep trying. So that's all I wanted to say, is that I don't need to repeat it, that we still have some time. They still have some time, at least in China, to work out what best systems they want, but there is a lot of work to be done, mainly in liberalizing the service sector, in opening it up to market competition a lot more, and in providing an efficient social support system to avoid poverty and inequality that might make the state non-sustainable in the end. Thank you. Yeah. All right. I'll take the questions. I see. Yeah.
Have you given thought to the relationship between the transition you're talking about and the other transition which is going to be taking place and necessary as the scale of the state sector, especially industrial state sector, is contracting? Yeah. I suppose off the top of the head, you think that might slow the deindustrialization process and perhaps even might be part of the management of the transition that you're talking about. Yeah. But on the other hand, it may frustrate the transition and weaken China's progress.
I agree. I agree entirely. Actually, I mean, it needs to be done for sure. In fact, the need is more urgent than in the private sector. And the only encouraging thing is that they are making the right noises now in China, from what I understand, although they haven't put it into practice yet. The reason I say that that I think it's going to be more difficult is that it was done to some extent, in fact, to quite a large extent, between 1997 and 2003. But recently, someone was telling me that there are still sit-ins and demonstrations and complaints by workers who lost their jobs in that period. Even now, they are sitting outside government offices saying we're still unemployed. And if that's the case, you know, I mean, it's 11 years ago. If that's the case, then you can imagine what was the potential for the next phase of downsizing the state sector. But it needs to be done, and the only suggestion I can make is to do it by offering generous support to the people to leave in the form of a severance pay, and then severance pay on the condition that they will not come back and when they spend the severance money, they come back and get their job, and they can afford it because they are earning so much money from abroad. But it's important to do it though, sort of now, as it were, when growth is still fast and jobs are being created at a fast rate, and in a way the period between 2003 and 2013, it was a wasted period in that respect. That the state sector, they continued at the same size, but productivity has been falling relative to the private sector. Which we had a lecture, in fact, only maybe 1-2 weeks ago here, which was where it was pointed out. It was more focused on this issue. Yeah.
Hi, Chris. So some prominent economists have been very critical of Chinese institutions as not being sufficiently developed, protective of property rights to really sustain growth over the long term. I'm wondering, in the context of your discussion of shifting to higher technology manufacturing or to high-level services, do you see this as a limiting factor? I mean, you mentioned that management and property rights were a question mark kind of for China. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering where you come out on this view, and if it means that China perhaps should shift more to high-tech industry. Maybe that depends less on these institutions and services, or maybe not. I'm just curious how you feel about that.
I mean, it's certainly the case in the service sector, in the sort of high-skill service sector, that the institutions are not good. At least they don't look good to support a more advanced development. And there they need to reform, especially in the financial sector, but also in having common standards across sort of accounting standards, tax returns, which are not good for a complicated, a big multinational that have complicated tax affairs will probably cheat them. It will be the easiest thing to cheat them. You know, the way the way Starbucks, for example, is supplying the whole of Europe with coffee, and they're paying tax in the lowest tax country in Europe, which is Luxembourg. I mean, this kind of thing, you need very good institutional structure to do it, and even the United States is struggling now to do it and control the financial sector. So that, in that respect, they need to do it. On the industrial side, it's a little bit puzzling in that you do see things that you would think that would be impediments to the functioning of companies. But when you talk to them and when you see them, they're saying that it doesn't bother them at all. For example, companies that, even startup companies that get finance from one of the big banks to start their business, they have a party secretary sitting on the board of directors. In fact, he's number 2 in the company with the CEO who does the work. So you would think that if there is hands-on government interference at that level, that the company wouldn't be able to perform in the way that the company should. I mean, politicians are not supposed to do these things. And yet they do it. Now, if companies become more complicated, if they become, if there's a Chinese company like Samsung, for example, which is private, and then it has government sitting on the board, it's likely to be more of a problem, because once you become multinational, you acquire political influence, political significance, and in that respect, they do need to reform, I believe. I think the system they have, it's not too bad for industry, and it might help them to carry on a little bit more like that, but not for too long. But it's not good enough to let the service sector take off. That's my impression, at least. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Chris.
Right.
With minimum wage going up, in different provinces and localities, and also collective bargaining and legislation on labor participation in management decisions, factories, and Guangdong, in fact, as you know, is having a legislation being discussed to pass on that. How about these moves? I mean, they're supposedly trying to raise the worker benefits and standards, maybe to stimulate consumption. But that also has, as you know, of course, has an effect of, sending factories maybe becoming less competitive. What do you think about how China is doing with that balance?
Well, in that respect, I mean, if we take the minimum wage, I think a well-chosen minimum wage is good for the labor market, actually, because the people that are mainly affected are the people who have the least information about jobs. They're the least educated and the ones with the least information. So they're always prone to being exploited by a big employer. They're not the ones that are well organized. They're ones that fear from the employer. They are not the ones that will be highly motivated to go and do the job because they don't know how much they will get. They don't know if they're being cheated. And in the United States, at least, they're the ones who go into criminal activity rather than go and work, because they say that, the employer is exploiting me, so why shouldn't I try and steal from them? Whereas a good minimum wage at least guarantees you, the government tells you that this is the minimum that you're worth, and you're going to get it, and go in there, and the law is protecting you, and it's good. And it's worked effectively, in fact, in the United States before the Bush administration let it go down to such low levels, especially in the fast food industry, where there was some famous research that was being done at the time. And it's also working well in Britain. That is bringing people out of the sort of council flats into jobs much more. Now, on the other hand, if it's too high, then of course it's what you're saying, it's the law interfering with employers, and employers not being able to employ workers across the board and doing their job as efficiently as possible. And we have the example of France in that respect, that they have a very high minimum wage, not to mention countries like Colombia, where it's 70% of the median. And that encourages people going into unrecorded black market activity. So the key with something like that is to get the minimum wage at a level that is just beneficial, it's so beneficial, and then it goes back, is to find that peak. In Britain got it right actually on the minimum wage. So the Blair government that introduced it, and the Conservatives are carrying on the same way, because they really got the right formula. They started from a fairly low level, and every year there is a low pay commission, a minimum wage commission that writes a report that is about a book this big, which studies the economic impact of the minimum wage, and if they feel that it's reaching levels that are too costly, prohibitive for governments, they recommend that it should be kept down. It's about 45 to 47% of the median wage. France got it wrong at about 55 to 60%. Colombia, that I went there last year, it's a complete disaster. It puts the majority of low-cost labor into the black market, completely unprotected. And the European Union is saying the right level now should be about 50% in between. It's about right. Now that applies also to other legislation and all that. I mean, when I say employers should be left alone to do their job, they should be left alone to do their job within the standards of good employment, good working conditions, because that gives an incentive to the worker as well to perform better. Like what hours do you work, what lunchtime do you break, do you take? If your employer suddenly needs some work in the middle of the night, could he call you at home and say, come to the office because we need to finish something, this interference with family life and all that. But those are secured by the International Labour Office, or the International Labour Office issues detailed guidelines of what's good working conditions. And I think once you secure those, then government shouldn't interfere more with employers, because those make sure that there is no exploitation of the worker. Employers might develop monopoly power, especially if they've got you on the inside and take advantage for you. I mean, the main thing is to secure against those. And unions might have a good role to play in that respect in securing it, but then there is always the fear that once they acquire more power, they start behaving like the monopolist against the employer, which is something that happened in my own country, in fact. So it's a matter of monitoring every time what's happening, trying the new legislation, but seeing how it works, and always be ready to come back to repeal, to amend, and so on, so as to avoid introducing rigidities in the labor market. But apart from the minimum wage proposals in China, I haven't seen any other legislation in detail to be able to comment on that, actually.
Participation in management, that's the latest.
Yeah, by workers, you mean. Yeah, I'm not in favor of that, actually, on the whole. But there are economists management people who study that say they're successful. Well-meaning, well-motivated participation could be good for the management. I think they have Scandinavian companies. I think they have participation in management. On the whole, though, I don't know. I mean, are unions or are workers good managers? I mean, do they have good management training? I mean, good governance requires specialized expertise, and they don't have it. On the other hand, if they sit there and start saying, we're concerned about the welfare of our members and all that, it's a disaster for the company. You should be concerned about the company as a whole, not just your members within the company.
Just one more.
I think a lot of people would share my view that China is still seeking its future, and it used to be a centrally planned economy until the late 70s, and then it has since marketized and become very capitalistic. My question is, do you think China should be going? I mean, where should China be going? I mean, what model should China be sort of imitating? I mean, should China be trying to go for like the welfare state kind of model in Europe, like Germany, like the Scandinavian countries, like Britain, or France, or the US? So my question is, what do you think What would be a nearest role model for China's future?
Well, first of all, the first part of your comment is that although it looks unique in what they are doing, and there might be some unique things. In fact, the economic development has come from the free market. It's only when sectors have been opening to free market competition that increase in productivity came, and I think that is undisputed now. Like I'm sure the vast majority of economists will tell you that if the only thing you are interested in is productivity growth, which brings economic growth and wealth, then there is no better system than free decentralized market, open competition, both domestic and abroad. Basically, Adam Smith got it right in 1776, basically, with growth. But if we leave it entirely alone, then there are many undesirable outcomes. And the biggest one is inequality. And then there is poverty in the midst of plenty, as they put it in the movies. Then there is unemployment with some long-term unemployment. Then it's got no system to support those unable to work, like disabled, mentally sick. So all those things, someone needs to take care of all those things. At least in my view, it's a kind of social awareness. You are more social aware than that. But I mean, there are economists. I think they're a minority, and they work mainly in the States. And I mean, it's no secret who they are because they say it in every opportunity in public, who believe that the market can take care of everything and you can leave those things alone, including the environment and everything else. For example, I was in a meeting only last week with Edward Prescott, and he was saying that. He said, no, government shouldn't be doing these things. The market should take care of it. But how? We know that it doesn't take care of it if you leave it alone. So in my view, it's absolutely essential to find a way, a social support way that does not rely entirely on the market mechanism. Now, whether it's a social support of the kind that Germany has, the sort of Bismarckian kind of state, whether it's the Anglo-Saxon type of state, which provides a support through markets by subsidizing markets, whether it's the Scandinavian, which provides it through public employment, it's a political choice more than an economic one. If you look at the Anglo-Saxon system, which is essentially provision of social services through subsidized market, by subsidizing the market more, by encouraging market participation to give them through the market, then it gives you a better outcome in terms of efficiency, higher GDP per head, for example, but not such good support of the poorer sections of society. And then it also gives you the kind of outcome that is obviously something wrong with it. For example, Britain post Thatcher, where it's been applying the system, has had a very big increase in disability. It cannot be that suddenly, with rising living standards, the British became disabled, that they could claim. It must be something to do with the National Health Service, doctors giving certificates for disability more likely. I mean, they may or may not be deserving, I don't know. But if you look at statistics, as you cut support somewhere else, it goes up somewhere in other places. And the main disability for which there are claims now is back pain. I have back pain all the time. I just take strong painkillers and carry on. It is. Or I do my exercises. Then, if you look at the Scandinavian system, a lot of people criticize it in that it's expensive. You pay 60% of your income in tax. And government needs to be trusted a lot. so if they tell you it's corrupt, once I was I was in Greece and I went to buy something from a shop that someone that happened to know me or recognize me or something, and she was telling me, the shop owner was telling me that they are all cheating. What can we do in this country? We have to stop cheating each other and the state and all that, and otherwise we won't go ahead. And I said, okay, I bought something from her shop, and then she said to me quietly, do you mind if I don't give you a receipt for this and you pay me in cash? And I looked at her and I said, isn't what you've been telling me? And she said, well, they have to do it first and then us. And she pointed to the Parliament building, which was nearby. I mean, it's like that. Then obviously Scandinavian system cannot work in those cases. Because, people just try to cheat because they don't trust politicians. So it's a political choice. And China is a puzzle to me, being not a political scientist, how they could combine free market economic development with the political system that they have. So I have no idea. It was a long-winded answer instead of just saying I don't know. But that's basically what it is.
Okay.
Let me see if I can help him answer his question.
Yeah.
I heard from a Chinese economist one time, so this is not my mind. He said China first used the Soviet Union economic model. Then in the 80s, it was clear that the Soviet economic model went bankrupt. And so they looked around and they found the Japanese economic model. And so they tried to emulate the Japanese model. Then Japan went into stagnation starting in the early 90s. And then they said, well, the Korean chaebol model, this is what the Chinese state-owned enterprise is going to copy. And then the Korean economic model went in trouble in the Asian financial crisis. Then they say, okay, fine, we're going to learn from Wall Street. We're going to learn the American model. And the American model went disastrous, downhill in the late, in 2008. So now the whole world all the countries are very worried that China is going to learn from them next as the role model.
Okay, so any more discussion can carry on outside reception, and you can meet Chris outside. So, thank you. Thank you, Sohmen.